All right. Well, I want to go ahead and actually welcome everybody out to the webinar today. My name is Keith Wilson. I'm going to be actually the host for today, as well as one of the speakers. Today's webinar is all about supply chain audits, and primarily the Textile Exchange series. I wanted to kind of introduce some of the other people that are actually on the conference call or the webinar here with me. It's Brian Mortensen, who is actually the Global Audits Director. We have our Jacob Wadsworth, who is our Global Director of Marketing, is also on the phone with us. And then we also have our two domestic auditors, Saimum Afrad, and also our other senior auditor, Lakan Dharmic, that is also on the phone with us. They're going to be taking a lot of the questions. Without further ado, here is actually the agenda for today's presentation. Quick little intro of IDFL, followed by some audits, the audits overview. This is basically just the history and overarching issues. Then we're going to spend some time in 3 or 4 of the different specific textile exchange standards, starting off with the content claim standards, followed by the different individual materials portions. Last of all, we're going to be spending a little bit of time on how to apply for a standard. We're not going to have enough time for the GOTS standard today, but we can do that at a future webinars. We're going to be having monthly webinars for a while. And we welcome you or any of your suppliers or colleagues to attend that as well. So without further ado, I just wanted to give a quick little overview and background of who IDFL is. The first thing I want to talk about is why IDFL. We're going to go through some of our staff, some of our clients, and the rest of the different details. And once again, we'll have a Q&A section at the very end. When we actually think about different QA partners and who people are, different clients and consumers and brand names, who they actually choose as a QA partner, we take this issue very seriously as a critical role of actually guaranteeing the quality of a brand name. IDFL was actually originally started off as a privately owned company, and it still is today. It was founded in 1978. And the IDFL is most popular for its testing services, or most well known for its testing services. But over the past 10 or 12 years, we've also been involved in the audits and certifications industry as well. IDFL is known for its vast industry. It's mostly its trust and integrity. And we try and take a personal approach. So when you call us up, you're not going to have to transfer phones 5 times. Our history, as I mentioned, we started back in 1978. Our founder, God bless his soul, he just passed away just this year. He's at the ripe old age of 94 years old. We've actually been picking up a lot of other services that are actually associated with materials. So we are basically just a laboratory that's actually added on inspection services, audit services, consulting, research and development, and a lot of other different aspects according to the needs of our clients. Next of all, right here, there's a lot of different things that actually that you can actually attribute to the success of our company. But I think when it all kind of comes down to it, it's basically our staff understanding how understanding how a company, our clients operate being able to provide needs for their services. There are specific ways that we kind of go through that we go through our processes. We have an internally built database that has actually collected data for almost the past 50 years. We have an advanced experience. One thing that we've always taken a lot of pride in is actually the integrity. We try and have the best customer service in the world, and we make sure that we're knowledgeable and understanding of our clients. In fact, as part of our mission statement, we try to have cost-effective services. We're not the Ferrari, we're not the bicycle, we're the practical car that gets you to and from work every day. And the customer service, once again, as I mentioned previously, is actually the best in the industry, and focusing on accuracy and integrity is the mission statement of IDFL. We have many different certifications and memberships that have actually kind of provided and substantiated the processes that we actually have internally. We're also members of many industry associations around the world, and we're joining a lot of the other local industries where you're at currently. IDFL currently has about 10 different offices around the world serving all the different locations. We have staff around the world that actually speaks those languages. Our key services are, as I previously mentioned, our laboratory services started off with actually testing the down, adding on textiles, later on polyfill, and now we basically provide almost every test that's actually needed in the industry. As far as audits and certifications, our audits and certifications are typically surrounded the traceability, the social compliance, the chemical compliance, and also the traceability. Last of all, we also have the technical consulting issues that I talked about previously with labeling compliance. We provided trainings around the world. We do many trainings around the world. So if you ever need a specific training, we'd be happy to work with you on that. Our services really kind of breach all the way from the birth of the materials all the way to the finished consumers. And we actually work with a lot of people that way. Our external clients, we've actually worked with many major name brands. As I mentioned previously, our history and our roots are really kind of in the field textiles. And so basically anybody that actually has a jacket or anything related to the bedding industry, they've been a client of ours. Many other laboratories and other places have also a lot of times subcontracted to us, as we are one of the world experts in the down and feather industry. Our clients really kind of come from around the world and providing different types of products. You know, it doesn't matter what country, what location, what product. We work with our clients in their needs. As far as internal clients, once again, this is one of our secret sauces. We hire some of the best staff around the world. Currently, we're not a majorly large company. We have only about 200 employees right now. But their experience is broad and deep, and we're really proud of that. One thing is actually making sure that we actually enable and empower each one of our employees so that they can actually make the right choices to serve our clients in the best way possible. As we actually look at our core values, we try to impress our clients. We make sure that we're accurate. We live with integrity. Here's actually some of the different core values that we have. As we actually, just to kind of wrap this up in a quick little summary, is basically we're an internationally positioned laboratory that has decades of experience that's applied this knowledge of materials and clients into the world industry and applied it towards a lot of other different services that we actually offer. So in conclusion, how can we help you? Please let us know. We're happy to hear from you, whether an email, chat, or a phone call. We're always happy to meet with our clients face to face. All right, so this first presentation is really about the supply chain overview. This is not getting into the nitty gritty. This is basically just kind of a 30,000 foot level, tip of the iceberg type of an approach. And basically what we wanted to kind of go through right here is talk briefly about the history and the background, why we're actually doing audits, why now, what type of audits, how are they developed, and all those associated issues. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So as we look back over the past 50 years of the development of the industry, of the textile industry, or rather any industry for that matter, is we've actually kind of things that are actually made locally and used locally to things that are actually purchased internationally and then used locally. There's a lot of developments that have actually improved. There's actually more specialization that's ever been available in the world. And as we've actually moved forward, there's been a lot of pros and there's a lot of cons. As we've actually been looking back, as we see a reckoning of the industry, we have created some wonderful things, some wonderful products, and a lot of the world has been lifted out of poverty into a better world today. But there's also a lot of people that are actually seeing the dystopia that has actually left oceans full of trash, undrinkable water, health problems as a result of different chemistries. And out of the industries in the world, the textile industry is one of the top polluters. So what actually happens right now is a lot of different companies and name brands and consumers are increasingly more and more concerned about the source of their products, about are they sustainable? Or are these products that they're creating today, are they basically going to be cursing other future generations, or how is this going to be looked at in the future? Name brands are trying to be more responsible and not, rather than just having empty promises that we're going to do better next year, they're actually kind of substantiating this through a lot of different types of audits. The one thing that is actually that is really kind of key that everybody understands is this new tribal support of sustainability. As we look at some of the different definitions available, sustainability is really kind of the processes and products which meet the needs of today's society without compromising resources of the needs of the future generations. And as we look at these different types of things, there are finite and there are infinite materials. So as a consumer actually shows up at a retail shop, they're going to be looking at the different types of materials. Is this a clean, ethical, sustainable material, or is this something that they've actually seen on the television that is actually kind of supporting poverty and treating people in horrible situations? And they want to, the name brands and also the consumers want to, fulfill these promises more and more. As the consumer actually kind of goes to the store, they might actually see something that's very beautiful, like the mannequins. But there's a lot, sometimes that the materials that are actually coming from around the world are not super clean, or they've came from a very unethical source. And so as these industries and as these companies engage with their global supply chains, they want to make sure that they are actually using their purchasing power to influence and improve the global situation as well. As we have actually seen the development of each one of as this internet and this transformation of the world has actually kind of moved forward, what we see is there's more and more people that are actually willing to provide as well as actually apply towards these standards. Some of the earliest standards that were internationally acceptable goes back to ISO back in the 1920s and during the World Wars. Then it was actually stopped until 1946. But really, like this industry of sustainability has actually been really been developing since the 1980s, pushed up more towards the 1990s. But as we actually see most of these minimum standards or these best practices in the 1980s, these have become minimum standards as requirements by ZDHC, Bluesign, Textile Exchange Sustainability, and all of the resulting standards that are actually been developed since then. Every one of these standards, once again, is pushing the industry forward faster, better, and cheaper in positive ways. As we look at every single one of these different standards, the key aspects that people are concerned about is the sustainability, as I previously mentioned. But as we look at each one of these different things, as the sustainability actually breaks down, people are wondering about the breakdown of the chemistry. The chemicals is actually a major aspect. What are the byproducts that is actually being created during the production of these chemicals? What is the effects on human health? There are many endocrine disruptors in actually the textile industry that cause problems with future generations. The materials, is the material reusable? Natural products like cotton, wool, down, those are infinite materials that are always going to be available. Whereas actually man-made materials, there's only so much of these materials in the earth that they can actually mine up, or we can actually dig up, or we can create. At the very end of that, at the very end of those availability, those materials are no longer available. Next of all is the social aspects. Are employers using the industry? Are the employees and the working conditions of the industry being treated well, or are they being improved? Previously, there are only issues of basically poverty, child and forced labor. But now we're looking at more and more of the overall the happiness of the employees. Nobody wants to work in a horrible place that's dangerous and might actually kind of get them killed. Everybody wants to spend time with their families. Last of all is actually the overall resources, or how are they actually using these resources, whether it's actually in shipping, packaging. Is this a sustainable material that can actually have a full life cycle and actually be recycled and things of that nature? All of these different types of things are actually affecting the sustainability. Well, as more and more companies actually, if Nike had these standards and other places had, Adidas had these other standards, sometimes those standards were actually congruent and they were actually, it was quick and effective. But a lot of other different places, sometimes they'd actually be contradictory, or these would actually be very complex issues to solve. So what the industry noticed is that they actually needed to work in unison and actually provide these requirements and these standards and these best practices in a substantiated way. And this is basically where all of these different standards kind of come from, and actually creating global standards, not this is a ABC company and that is a XYZ company standard. All of these standards are actually working together so that the suppliers only are required to have one specific standard that they apply for. The key aspects of each one of these different standards, despite the material, is basically, as we look at these are actually some textile exchange specific issues, but basically the scope certificate validates that this company is capable of taking inputs and actually providing finished products or outputs. And then there's actually the transaction certificates that actually track the materials from the farmer or the source all the way to the finished product. And this is actually the standard or the basis of all of the different standards. As we look at this, this traceability is a common factor throughout all standards. But as we look at some material-specific details, you will actually see here that there are different types of aspects that are related to these issues. It might be animal welfare products. It might actually be regards to recycled inputs. There might be social and chemical aspects, as I previously mentioned. But every one of these, as you can see, the CCS, the Content Claim Standard, is basically all across the board. Everybody has to have a way to source that this finished product necessarily is organic, or is it ethical, or is it sustainable, or is it recycled? And then that's basically what these content claim standards move directly into the final claim standards that are actually found on the hang tags of every specific article. As we look at all the different fibers across the world, there's probably got to be about 100 different fibers right here. Some of them are actually natural. For example, as I mentioned with the animal source products, the mohair, the wool, the down, the alpaca, even like maybe in the future they're going to have more and more Angora and things of that nature. They want to be making sure that these animals are actually being taken care of. In regards to the organic stuff, then they basically just want to make sure that this field really is organic, that it is not, there's no GMOs or anything of that nature. In regards to the RCS and the GRS, the Recycled Claim Standard and the Global Recycling Standard, they just basically want to make sure that these are in fact post-consumer, or are they pre-consumer, or where are these materials coming from? As you look at each one of these different issues, here's actually the same type of a thing shown in a chart form. All of these different standards address different types of materials, and this is basically how the different standards apply to each one of those standards. But once again, you know, the main aspect is actually sustainable source inputs, going through the traceability of the entire supply chain, and then actually like correct labeling on the finished product. As we look at every one of these different standards, every one of them, there's a book written about them, and this is what the books look like. They're easily downloaded online. But as we look at each one of these different aspects, there is plenty of information that can actually be seen. There is the scheme, and the author is actually shown up here at the top. There's also the different sections. And we're going to be going through a lot of these, basically focusing really primarily on the desired outcomes. And then you'll also see over here the CMI, the MA. These are critical, minor, and major issues. This is basically how they are actually portrayed within each one of the different respective standards. Is that the recommendation is basically the best practices. It's good if you actually do that, but right now it's not necessarily required. It might actually become a minor issue in a future standard, though, as you actually see the objective of this is actually making everyone climb to the top of that mountain, not to just kind of do the minimum requirements, but a constant improvement. So today's industry is better than yesterday's industry, but tomorrow's industry is better than today's. These critical issues and all the minor, major, and critical issues are, despite if they're fixed or not, there is a specific time that actually kind of allows you to actually fix these different issues. And that's basically how the majority of these standards are actually held. Now, as we kind of look about well, there's actually, I know that there's a certifying body, but I don't know, where does this certifying body get their where do they get their authority to actually provide these? Well, this usually kind of comes as a result of the certifier, the scheme owner, which in this case is actually Textile Exchange, working in accordance with the national accreditation bodies. As you can see here, there's the EA, there's the TAF, ANSI, and ANAB, these different types of global organizations respective of each individual country. They work together to provide accredited certification bodies, or also known as CBs. These CBs then actually take the authored standards by the scheme owner, and they actually apply that standard towards the supply chain. And then the supply chain provides the certified products. This is a kind of a quick little overview of how these scheme owners, or how these schemes work, and how does everything process within inside of that. Now, each one of these different documentations that I was speaking about previously, they're usually available in multiple different languages. There's different types of templates that are actually available. There's different types of data. There's different reports that are actually showing the improvement from year to year, and all the rest of those different types of details. Each one of these standards is at a different maturity level. You'll see that right here that the OCS is actually a 3.0, GRS is at a 4.0. That's they've gone through 1, 2, 3. Now they're final at a 4.0. As I just shown at a previous slide, the blue sign is actually a very popular standard. It's in its 9.0, so it's a very matured standard. And here's actually a lot of the other different types of manuals. Last of all, we actually have the actual logo use, which is basically what everybody, all the final buyers are actually looking for. And each one of these different logos is basically affixed to either their marketing online, their magazines, or how it's supposed to look on the actual product itself. Last of all, as part of this is basically that as you actually see that there's not just a few companies that are adopting these standards. It's becoming more, not just popular, but it's becoming an industry standard across the world for any major name brand to fulfill some of these different types of objectives. So that actually concludes our first portion right here. As mentioned previously, I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. We wanted to spend, and the next presentation is going to be in the same format as all the rest of the presentations. We're just going to have about a 5-minute overview. We could spend an entire day, maybe even an entire week on some of these different standards because they're very in-depth and have a lot of different caveats. But we wanted to basically kind of give a quick little overview, just kind of addressing some of the different aspects of these different standards. So we wanted to spend just a little time on the overview, details of the standards. They're going to go section by section intro. And then once again, we'll have a summary and Q&A at the very end. So just kind of going ahead right here, the major objective, as Brian just actually clearly emphasized, is basically the objective of the CCS is basically the traceability, connecting the source with the final label on the finished product. And so as we actually look at each one of these different things, you know, that this client or the content claim standard is really tracking the flow of raw materials from source to the finished product through documentation, volume reconciliations, and segregation of materials and products. And it is the basis for all material standards and traceability as shown in the previous slides. Now I wanted to go through a handful of these different key points. I'm just going to bring these up right here. The first one is actually the first thing to introduce or explain is that the content claim is not a consumer-facing logo. You'll never see a finished product with the content claim standard logo on top of it. This is all voluntary. These are not to replace local standards. So if you're actually in the US, it's the AATCC or the ASTM, or if you're in Europe, then you're using ISO or DIN methods. These are not replacements for those different types of quality standards. This is all about traceability. These are all voluntary. Standards can be used with any material. So anything less than 5% doesn't count, all the way up to 100%. These are international standards, as materials are actually known throughout the world. So these are international standards. The CCS can be used to verify a specific regional source. As you can see, this is actually made in France. CCS would actually be the last 2 points to connect those two different aspects of connecting the France with the consumer. In the down industry, there's always, this is Canadian down and this is Hungarian down. And that the CCS is very effective at actually tracking the material as it goes through the supply chain for those different regional claims. The material is tracked using the TCs, as they're actually known as the transaction certificates, that are basically accompanying these invoices, the official invoices from country to country or company to company. The same certification body, like IDFL, also issues the certification and the TCs. So if you actually get your company certified by IDFL, IDFL will also provide the transaction certificates, and that's one of the important and key decisions of the audit. And then last of all, certification companies are expected to be organized and responsible for all of their actions. And that's basically what the scope certificate is actually addressing, and making sure that there's actually competence there. The next thing is that there's also material needs to be properly identified, listing out, is it 80% this, 20% this, what type of different unique identifiers are there with the material so the material is not confused. Integrity is maintained. This is, no standard or nothing within the industry is going to exist without the honesty and the integrity of the actual players themselves. The certification bodies also must be competent in providing their services. And once again, this kind of comes back to the way that IDFL actually hires staff. The certified organization must demonstrate their compliance, their products that they can produce, and then also the activities that they perform in accordance with the CCS. And I think the right perspective of all of our auditors has always been to prove that your system works. Make sure that you can actually identify this material with this document and connecting all of those together. And then last of all, the final buyers or any buyer along the supply chain must actually have the confidence that the products that they receive are that they're full of integrity and that the documentation does match this. So these are some of just the general overview of the CCS standard. The next thing that we actually see right here is the procedures must be in place that actually that support the entire standard. The documentation must be followed throughout the process. The employees must understand the purpose and requirements of the CCS. So this actually requires just a little bit of training. If a auditor shows up and asks questions about this person that's actually either the accountant or maybe like a line worker, that they can actually validate and say, well, this actually goes here, and this is actually the documentation. Here's the SOP, and I'm an expert in the part or the link with inside the company of the chain of the supply chain. Material has unique properties and identity is preserved. As it kind of is, sometimes materials, as they go from bamboo into other different types of materials, the cellulose and on to the rayon, there has to be consistency with actually the identity of the products themselves. The standard must be protected in the marketplace. There's many companies out there, particularly with the animal protection agencies, that actually are trying to pull apart these different types of standards, and it's good to make sure that there's a unified industry-wide thing, a solution that's actually solving these problems. And then last of all, there's procedures that are in place to maintain the integrity of the claimed material throughout the processing, the internal processes, the external processes, the sub points as the material kind of goes throughout the factory. There must be, with all of the standards, we're going to be repeating this throughout the rest of the presentations today, is there can be no commingling of materials, whether that's at a slaughterhouse or that's at a processing unit or at the final place of manufacturing, even throughout shipping. There can be no commingling of the materials. The materials must be identified and separated and not substituted. So you can actually see that, all right, this side of the wall is actually certified, this is actually not certified. In fact, there's a lot of places where they actually prefer that there is no dual production. There is also no commingling of materials during transport. They have to be separated. There can be no commingling of materials in storage. And then the CCS is not used to substantiate the sustainability of the claimed material itself. Once again, as you can see right here, these tags, these would not be allowed. That it says that the CCS organic. That's an improper use of the standard. Next of all, the certification body conducts interviews with organization staff for observation and compliance, which is what I was just talking about previously about the training of the staff, making sure that everybody along the supply chain understands every step of the process. The certification body observes ongoing compliance to incentivize constant compliance. The certification body must have a very tight relationship with each one of the different manufacturers. With our relationships at IDFL, that makes it really easy because we've been working with a lot of clients and finding ways to help them succeed in each one of the different aspects since the beginning of the company. Organizations found not to be compliant with the CCS must make appropriate corrections in a timely manner. As I previously spoke, whether it's minor, major, or critical major, there's usually like 30 to 60 days to actually kind of correct these actions. And the company must make those corrections to maintain their certification. The CBs make certification decisions based on recent observations of operations. So the CB will come into the location and make a decision based upon what they've seen now, what they've seen in the past, what the overall objective and direction and goals of the company are. The possibility of an audit at any time incentivizes constant compliance. These are actually known as surprise audits, but I mean, like, the objective here is basically the time that the location is actually able to prepare for the audit, as that actually incentivizes constant compliance. And then last of all is the integrity of the CCS product is maintained with each ownership change after production is complete. So as it kind of goes from factory to factory, from step to step within each one of the different processes, that every single step of the way is actually documented and the integrity of the material is maintained. As I previously mentioned, even when materials is not in possession, even if it's in storage, and obviously most materials today are actually exported in ocean liners and whatnot. So these materials, they have to have the cartons or the boxes that they're actually being put inside of. That all of these different, the integrity must be maintained, even if the factory or the owner does not have physical possession of the certified material. This is also very particular with trading companies. Next of all is the CB assesses the organization's complete operations related to the CCS product. Once again, making sure that the documentation, the processes, and the material is all synced. The CB is able to assess all location where the CCS product flows. So if there are specific steps, actually, or intermediary steps in between, then every one of these steps must be tracked. The CB is able to prepare a thorough and efficient on-site audit So as the CB actually arrives at the location, there could be no secret closets or places that are not available. The entire process has to be available for the certification body to review and inspect. And then next of all here is actually the buyers have proof that the products they receive are certified and that the chain of custody is maintained. Any specific weak links within a specific organization or a specific entity really kind of neglects the entire operation and the entire supply chain for all of the rest of the different providers. Organizations do not sell more products than they were able to produce given the CCS inputs available. So as you can actually see right here, as you actually see capacity versus the material sold, this is not congruent, and this is why you have a mass I forget the name of it. It's the mass balance sheet, or the reconciliation. Next here is actually about some specific exemptions. If you are actually adding on the sewn in label into a garment, that actually addresses many different issues. But that's only during when the garment is actually manufactured. Next of all is actually brands that exclusively use certified claim materials in all applicable products may have eligible for exemptions to the consumer-facing standards. This is actually one of those critical issues. Is basically if major name brands, if they actually have strong contracts and they are able to actually track every single step inside of each one of every single supplier, then this basically kind of simplifies the process. And it makes the application process just a little bit better. So this is actually another incentive for your supplier, for your buyers to be closer with you, and you to be closer to your buyers, and you have specific supply chains providing specific products. So this is one of those exemptions. I also do want to mention that this is one of those things that may actually be changing. I understood that this CCS standard is going to be updated shortly. So here is actually just basically a quick little summary here of actually the standard. There has to be trust between the buyer and seller, confidence within the auditor, traceability from beginning to end, and then actually documentation of internal and external processes. So the common failures that we actually see is, when these standards actually originally initiated, a lot of people just thought if they actually paid Textile Exchange $5,000, then they'd actually be okay. It's not a fee-based system. It's actually a material management system, which makes it a lot more like an ISO system that requires, auditors to come and see it, actually the traceability of the materials. And as soon as you're actually inside the process, as soon as you're actually inside the certified process, it's good to maintain those records. Materials processes don't match the documentation. These are just some of the minor infractions and making sure, like, hey, this material's over here, but it's documented as here, and the SOPs like that. There's a little bit of incompliances and things like that. We're going to move on to the RDS standard, and as previously mentioned, what we're going to be going through is basically just kind of the overview. We're going to be talking about some of the specific standard sections, common failures, and then wrap up with Q&A. So first off, this is actually one of the very first standards that actually brought textile exchange from organic exchange. Previously, textile exchange was only addressing OCS issues very similar to GOTS. It was actually the down and feather industry that had an issue right around 2009, 2010 that actually that erupted the entire global supply chain of the down industry. So IDFL was really at the very heart of this. In about 2009, 2010, there was a big issue in actually addressing stopping live plucking of the down and feather from the geese, as you can see in the picture here. About a year later, the animal protection groups actually moved on to the stopping of the forced feeding. So this is actually used in the foie gras industry in France, and is actually a French delicacy, but it was very inhumane for the actual animals themselves, as they were actually being forced to eat. But these two issues eventually developed into the general animal welfare. And this animal welfare, these different topics and the different standards that are actually developed at that time, really moved towards just the entire health and happiness of the actual animal itself. Even though many of the animals are going to be taken to slaughter, they want to make sure that the animal is taken care of up to that point. Last of all, you have the chain of custody and these other credible certification and the confident communication and the stakeholder engagement. And this is actually leads into some of the RDS objectives. That was just a little bit of a history, but here is actually the RDS objectives. that the down and feathers are not coming from any bird that has actually been subdued to unnecessary harm. There's also an aspect of rewarding and influencing the down and feather industry to improve the practices that respect the humane treatment of ducks and geese. The next one is provide companies with a tool to know that what is in their product. And last of all is actually having a chain of custody for certified materials as they move through the supply chain. Now, the down supply chain is a little bit more unique than other industries because, down and feather is never woven into fabric. Down and feather is always blended and mixed and things of that nature. That kind of creates some different issues and things of that nature. The down and feathers, basically all of the down and feathers is generally coming from the offspring of the birds. And then it kind of, and then the meat industry goes this way, and then the down and feather goes this way. But then sometimes there's actually an issue about the parent farm, like the mother and father goose or the mother and father duck. And that's basically where the parent farm and the hatchery is actually included. But is actually whether the down is actually coming from any of these sources, tracking the down as it basically kind of goes from when the product is harvested all the way up until the finished product is one of those key aspects. And once again, sometimes goose is blended with duck and duck is blended with goose, and different types of blends and things of that nature to meet different qualities like fill power and content, or maybe respective country guidelines on what constitutes goose or what constitutes duck or things of that nature. And this is once again one of the things that we're very capable of actually addressing from a laboratory and also from a traceability aspect. Now, as we look at this, I've already addressed the different the recommendations, minor, major, critical. Those are just those aspects, and the CCS is actually applicable to the RDS. This is a global applied standard. It's early on in the development of the standard, there was a TDS, which was the traceable down standard. The traceable down standard was the brainchild of Patagonia that actually required the parent farm to actually be included as part of the development. But there's, as part of RDS, that it's possible that you can do that, but it's not really available. And the TDS may actually over time might actually have some different changes there too. The RDS claims may be product specific or general with greater than 5%. The waterfall application, only goose or duck is actually allowed, not any landfowl or anything of that nature. The unique difficult point of the down is, just like I said previously, is like water, and unlike textiles, down and feather can always be mixed and blended and changed throughout the entire supply chain. Until it's actually in the finished product, it can actually be blended and changed. And that's one of those key aspects of actually the traceability of these. And last of all, this has never been a real issue to my knowledge, but sometimes I think that there's actually some geese and some ducks that are actually harvested that are not farm birds, but they're actually wild birds, and those are not available. As we look at the major desired outcome modules, this is very common with many of the animal standards, is basically just looking at the nutrition, living environment, animal management, handling and transport, the management, the plans, and the procedures, and last of all, the slaughter. So these are basically each one of the different individual modules that's actually included. It starts off with making sure that there's actually sufficient food and water, making sure that they actually have a house, making sure that the injured animals or the sick animals are actually addressed to, making sure that the animals are treated with care and transported carefully, no birds are chucked or thrown or dropped or anything of that nature, making sure that farmers can actually safeguard the welfare of their animals. This is from from cats or dogs or other types of things that would actually cause the birds to be stressed. And then last of all, slaughter minimizes pain. Animals are stunned and unconscious prior to slaughter. The slaughter process is actually one of those key aspects of making sure that's actually done in a humane fashion. So the slaughterhouses, there's actually a lot of requirements for the slaughterhouses, making sure that they're actually able to track the number of birds, if it is actually certified or not, making sure that they actually know the origin or where the farm actually is. And then there's next of all, making sure that the RDS and the non-RDS material is actually completely separated. And then making sure that the documentation actually is attached to that certified material. Throughout the rest of the supply chain, it's basically tracking through, making sure that there's constant identification, segregation, before and after production, and the machines are clean if they're actually going to be going from RDS to non-RDS material. And then managing down and feather material for shipping. This is actually another one of those major issues, making sure that the down is not being blended. What a lot of the industry is actually accepted is basically just having the RDS bags and the non-RDS bags, and that basically identifies the material inside of it. And then actually, last of all, is actually the product labeling. So this is actually the final step of the supply chain. There are other standards. There is the IDS, which is the IDFL down traceability standard. And this is basically just a welfare standard in traceability. People have actually requested us to actually kind of provide them with something that's a little bit cheaper for their specific needs. And this is basically a standard that actually outlines the different the animal welfare and the traceability. And this basically serves as a blueprint for a lot of other independent systems. There's also the TROMPOS and the DOWNPOS. This actually implements the EU regulations. This is actually one of the first standards to actually the IDS was actually the very first standard that was available, but then the DOWNPOS and the TROMPOS was actually one that was actually available after that. Last of all, there's the JTAS. So this is the Japanese Traceability Accreditation System. And basically what was actually happening was Hungarian material was going through China and then from China onto Japan. But then there was a lot of Chinese material that was actually added to the Hungarian material before it went to Japan. So there'd be like 1 ton of Hungarian material coming in, and then Japan would be sold 10 tons of Hungarian material from this Chinese entity. So this JTAS system really kind of addresses that issue. There's lots of other different brands and industry association standards available, in regards to the different name brands and whatnot. In summary, IDFL is one of the most experienced companies to actually provide this. There are a lot of different intricacies in regards to the traceability of down. And IDFL has actually been working with Textile Exchange and RDS since the very beginning in the development of this standard. IDFL is actually on the steering committee. We are actually one of the partners. We've worked with many of the down suppliers since the beginning of IDFL. So that we definitely have a good history there. The next thing here is basically just some common failures and misunderstandings. Down has many blends and mixtures, and you can always blend it back and forth. It's sometimes difficult to contain because it flies around. RDS cannot apply to recycled down material, only applies to virgin material. And that's because, down can fly around in the factory. We'll be talking about that a little bit more as we kind of get into GRS and the RCS. There's sometimes difficulties with actually the mass balance sheet, because like many other agricultural products, down can absorb anywhere from 10 to 20% of its actual weight post washing and things of that nature. So you might actually have a ton of down come in, but then you'll only have about maybe like 0.8, 0.9 tons actually exiting the factory. And that might be because of high moisture, or maybe vice versa. It comes in, it's actually washed, and then it actually has a moisture gain after the washing process. So there are some problems with that. Wanted to kind of jump in here into the GRS. Now the GRS is actually very similar to the RCS, and we're going to be talking about those as basically the standard process right here. We're going to go over some of the main objectives of the standard, the details of the standard section by section, the failures, and then also the FAQ at the end. So a lot of key questions that people actually ask about is basically what are the key differences in the RCS and the GRS? And GRS and RCS are basically the same standard for recycled materials. GRS exceeds only with the social, chemical, environmental requirements. As you look at this, as you look at the chart down here, you can actually see that there's each one of the only difference is the social, chemical, and environmental issues. The other thing is basically the GRS requires greater than 50% certified material. And then actually you can actually have you need to have at least 95% in order to actually meet the 100, the GRS or the RCS 100. Whereas RCS can actually start at 5%. So if you have a material that's basically 5 to 49%, it's probably best to actually kind of work with the RCS. And if you don't have the chemical and the social and the environmental, then the RCS is actually a better standard. If you do have the social, chemical, and environmental stuff in line already, and then you have something that's greater than 50%, then the GRS would actually be a better standard for there. There are also a few other points right here. The GRS actually uses it uses some of the ISO definitions to actually kind of for unison to actually kind of get those definitions out. They both actually require the credible certification, a professional third-party certification audit at each stage of the supply chain. There's also responsible production that's actually required that restricts certain chemicals that are actually used as part of the process. There's also the making sure that there's actually confident communication. Products that meet all requirements may be labeled with the RCS or the GRS logo. There's the chain of custody that's actually, once again, kind of a part of the content claim standard. And then there's also the stakeholder engagement. There's a lot of other points right here. The GRS and RCS both have the same objectives: to align the definitions across the multiple applications, track and trace the materials, to provide consumers with a tool to make informed decisions, and provide assurance that materials are actually part of the standard. The next thing right here, these are GRS and RCS. These are GRS specific issues, is to reduce the harmful impact of production on people and the environment. That's the social aspect. And then there's also the aspect of providing assurance that materials in the final product are actually recycled and processed more sustainably. And then last of all, drive innovation in addressing quality issues in the use of recycled materials. As similar to many of the other standards, there is also a lot of different general points that are actually acceptable. It's international, it's voluntary. There's the different types of compliance issues associated with that. There's the CCS and also the logo usage overview. There's a lot of similarities between the GRS and the RCS, as I just explained. There's also the GRS requires greater than 20%, where it is the whole product standard for the RCS requires greater than 5%. The major aspects, as I already mentioned, the social, chemical, and environmental. And then there's also a lot of use of the ISO 14021 and the FTC definitions for the further applications here. The unique and the interesting thing about the RCS and the OCS is it really actually kind of addresses almost all of the different types of fibers that are actually found around the world, whether they're actually manufactured, natural, whether they're organic, non-organic, protein, cellulose, or otherwise. There's a lot of different types of materials. Now, a lot of these materials, like the the RDS is specific to down. There is also the RWS that's specific to wool, but the RCS and the GRS are literally applicable towards all of the different types of materials around the world. So as I actually kind of get it, as we actually look at some of these, I wanted to kind of first dive into some of the different definitions. As we look at material collection, let me actually just go ahead and actually get all of these actually lined out right here. Each one of these definitions are very critical, because as you actually think of something recycled, people have different objectives and the understanding of what recycled actually means. Does that actually mean putting it into the bin, or does that actually mean the actual process in converting? And each one of these definitions really delineates and separates each one of those different aspects. So as we actually look at some of these, two that are actually worth mentioning is the pre-consumer versus the post-consumer. The pre-consumer material is maybe something, as you actually have all the different textiles, as they're actually cutting out specific pieces, all of that waste that is actually not used towards the finished product, those would actually be considered pre-consumer materials. Whereas the post-consumer material is basically, I use the shirt, now on my cotton shirt, I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it into another product, maybe a housing insulation or something of that nature. But each one of these different definitions is really critical to kind of dive in and make sure that you understand clearly. The key desired outcomes here is basically the recycled material is basically traced from A to Z. Also, you have the accompanying documentation that the workers are actually protected and safely, specifically in regards to the chemicals. The environmental requirements, it requires the facilities involved in the production of GRS products have strong environmental protections in place. As you look at the disposal and the collection aspect, a lot of the different byproducts of the recycling process can sometimes be kind of difficult, harmful to the environment. And last of all is actually the chemical requirements. The chemicals used in the production of GRS it must not harm the workers, and that's why there's that social aspect, social and chemical requirements. Common failures and misunderstandings of the GRS and the RCS is basically the similarities and the differences between the two different standards. Do we actually go for the high standard, or we actually start with maybe the RCS and actually progress slowly and making it step by step? There's a lot of different definitions, the pre versus the post consumers I just kind of outlined right there. There's also the harmony between documentations and processes and definitions and updates to standards. This is something that I've actually found that is actually very consistent with a lot of different standards, is basically making sure that your internal processes actually match the actual standards themselves. And then as it kind of goes from like version 1.0 to 2.0, making sure that your internal standards are also going from 1.0 to 2.0. And there's also, a common problem is also the proper chemical management, the safety, the labeling, and the storage. So that basically wraps up our this part about RCS and GRS. Wanted to jump into the OCS standard, and we'll just kind of go through this. Same thing as we've actually done with most of the other standards here. Is basically the overview, section by section, and then some questions and answers at the end. The overall objectives of the OCS objectives are basically to provide the industry with a tool similar to all the other standards, provide the companies with the trusted tool to communicate the claims, and then the third one, this is very unique to the OCS standard, is provide organic fiber farmers with broad access to the global organic market for their products. Sometimes you'd actually have people that couldn't buy the organic cotton, and sometimes you have the farmer that couldn't actually sell the organic cotton. So it actually is kind of helpful in kind of basically connecting those two different the need with the supplier. As we kind of go through this, the key points of the OCS are just basically verifying the content is only material from the certified organic farm is acceptable into the OCS. So that's actually according to the iPhone family of standards. Second of all is also related to the CCS, the content claim standard, is making sure that all of the steps are actually documented correctly and that there's actually credible certification, that the professional third party can actually audit each stage in the supply chain. Once again, if there's actually aspects out there that are not actually audited, it kind of like it makes a weak link within the entire supply chain. Confident communication, products that meet the requirements may be labeled with the OCS logo. So this is basically something that everybody's actually looking for. They want to actually sell organic cotton T-shirts, but they actually need the label. So the major objective of the OCS is actually providing the label for the finished product, the finished consumer, for the final consumer. Last of all is the stakeholder engagement. There has to be buy-in from the very top to the very bottom. The OCS is managed with the input of producers, suppliers, and brands. So if you ever have any suggestions, you can actually kind of send those suggestions in. There's actually emails available on the actual standard, and you can go through and send them over an email that says that this is a concern or this is a problem that it provides that causes companies to in compliance, or there's actually maybe exceptions that need to be made within the standard itself. The general points is basically similar to a lot of the other standards. It's international, it's voluntary. There's the minor, major, and critical issues. There's the CCS and then the local usage. There are a lot of similarities between OCS and GOTS that are closely related. There's also the goal to increase organic agricultural production, as we already mentioned. I also want to actually kind of give a quick little shout out to Textile Exchanges. This was, I think, to my knowledge, their very first standard that they actually provided. And it was developed with a lot of, all right. So there's the major desired outcomes as part of the standard is basically the consumer facing claims that mention that the OCS are controlled in order to protect the integrity of the standard. So once again, what's actually listed on the label must actually meet what's actually happening throughout the rest of the supply chain for the integrity and the trust of the consumer to continue. The verification of organically grown material is allowed. Organically grown material input is defined and verified. So we need to actually have a very different separation here of what's actually GMO, what's actually organic, what's actually has pesticides, what actually doesn't, and a lot of those related issues. And last of all, here is the part D, really kind of is part of the major desired outcomes is actually the chain of custody here, whereas actually the integrity of the organically grown material is maintained throughout to the final consumer. Some of the points that we actually address right here throughout the rest of the standard here is basically kind of coming back to some of the different definitions. As you look at some of these right here, the OCS products must contain at least 5% of the material. And then the claims related to the OCS may be either product specific or brand specific. So you can, or a product, each one of the different materials or different styles or things of that nature it allows a lot of diversity in that aspect. The first processor has the traceability system and the certification from either the USDA or the EU certification location, or the country specific and wherever they're actually located. Genetically, GMOs must be tested on cotton at an early stage to make sure that it actually is in fact organic. The next thing here is actually making sure that they have to have the scope certificates and also the transaction certificates. The in-conversion, so in certain standards, is basically if you actually have non-organic material here, and then you want to switch over to organic, there might actually be a year in between time where the cotton that is actually produced may not be considered organic cotton unless it's within a year. In that certain situation, it depends upon the actual standard itself, which is either USDA or the European method or the local method, whatever is actually the equivalent. The organic cotton organization shall cooperate and perform the GMO testing in accordance with the OCS 103 GMO. So basically, this is actually just making sure that the organization is actually getting the organic cotton is not being dishonest in any way. There was a big issue in regards to this in the news about 1 or 2 years ago, where organic Egyptian cotton or long staple cotton was in fact not so. So that actually caused a lot of distrust within the industry. And then last of all, processors shall not accept organic wool as an input if it is non-mules. So this actually happens when you have the cotton wool combinations or the blends in that regard. This is actually just in regards to the chain of custody. This is part D of the standard. It just basically kind of goes to the standard content claim standard, where you have the identification, segregation, the volume reconciliation. And then you also have wherever you're actually doing the volume reconciliation, you can always do the quick fiber test at the gin that is actually required as part of the standard. And then you can also do the technical specifications of the inputs, whereas the organization maintains the types of records and the types of standard or type of material that is actually going into it. A big question that people always have is actually kind of comparisons and similarities between GOTS and the OCS. The GOTS basically covers the fiber and processing claims. It's also been identified as the USDA as acceptable verification for labeling products as organic. I think that's only specific to the US market. The OCS is only a content claim standard, and it is not recognized by the USDA. Both actually have marketed their logos and actually are very well organized and recognizable by consumers, and both allow for on or off product labeling. So there's a lot of different variations, but this is just a simple comparison of the GOTS versus the OCS. One thing that's actually interesting is that the GOTS is a more rigorous standard, so it can actually be used as inputs into the OCS, but OCS material cannot be an input for the GOTS because it actually is coming from a lower standard. Common failures is basically the chemistry is what counts as organic or what counts as clean. There's also a transfer time that I just mentioned in the conversion. How long is actually the specific place that the organic material has actually been coming from been considered an organic field? And then there's also a lot of problems with, just as I mentioned previously, documentation, commingling, system matching, processes, and all that type of information. So that basically just wraps up our crash course in OCS. So let's go ahead and actually get started with responsible wool standard. As we've actually done with a lot of the other standards here, basically we're just going to do a quick overview of the objective of the standard, the application, similarities, and things of that nature. As we look at specifically at wool, we're looking at, only wool from sheep is actually allowed. Obviously, mohair, viscuna, alpaca are not acceptable because they have the standards of their own, but sometimes there's a lot of similarities between hair breeds of sheep versus wool breeds of sheep. So, and sometimes there's some crossbreeds and things of that nature that are available as well. So wool can actually, this is like an international standard. But let's kind of go through all these different issues really quick. The major objectives of the RWS ensure that wool does not come from animals that have been subjected to any unnecessary harm. Now, there are some animals that actually might get a little bit harmed in the shearing process. I myself actually grew up on a sheep farm, and it just kind of depends upon the security and the safety of the tenderness or the care of the shear that actually kind of addresses that. So that's, no harm is difficult, especially with yearlings or lambs that are actually being sheared. But, the older the sheep gets, the more and more comfortable they actually get. Kind of an interesting aspect there. There's also a lot of reward and influence for the wool industry to actually improve their standards. Next thing objective here is basically providing robust chain of custody, and then also creating a benchmark for the industry for constant improvement. Those are kind of basically the RWS objectives. The wool standard scopes actually begin at the farmer. As soon as they actually has been shorn, then that material is actually certified to RWS, as long as the farm and the shearing process is all RWS certified. And then that material is basically tracked throughout the rest of the supply chain. You can see that the standard scopes right here, that there is some animal welfare. One thing that is very unique for the RWS is the additional land management aspect. This is basically making sure that the animals and the land that they're actually grazing is actually being taken care of. In certain locations, particularly in the United States, crop rotation and rest, 3-year rest cycles are actually required for a lot of the different farms that are actually located there. As we actually look specifically at the scopes, though, there's actually the RWS requires all sites to be certified, and the farms need to be certified. This is actually really kind of management of the inputs. So if the farmer's actually been certified in the RWS, the rest of it's just basically kind of the CCS, basically tracking the material throughout the rest of the process. And then you can actually see right here that the garment, the brand, and the consumers and the retailers basically just kind of use the labeling and the logo portions. The chain of custody, this is actually a really good slide that is actually provided by Textile Exchange that really kind of shows a lot of the different complexities of the chain of custody, in particular in relation to the wool. So you can actually see a lot of these different types of aspects in the material that is certified versus the material that is not certified, and some of the different ways that the material comes through the industry that way. But the chain of custody for most of the materials is really just kind of tracking the inputs and making sure that is maintained all the way to the finished product. Some intro points that you can actually see right here that there's actually very similar to a lot of the rest of the standards. There's the minor, major, critical issues that are actually recommended. This is a global application for this standard. The identification is one of the content claim standard issues. And then we also have the segregation. The materials are completely and clearly identified. And that can actually be everything from the wool bag all the way to the finished product. And then very similar also with the down is actually the volume reconciliation. Once again, as an agricultural product, you have the shrink and the moisture uptake or the absorption of the moisture throughout the different locations. That the weight of the wool can actually kind of increase or decrease based upon what type of wool it is, the amount of grease on the outside of the wool, and a lot of other different aspects. So that's one of those volume reconciliation aspects that's unique to the RWS. The common failures and misunderstanding is basically the input certification requirements. Sometimes in regards to specific farming practices, there can be kind of some issues in regards to the land management aspect, depending on if that's actually a grazing farm or an open range farm. There's also a chain of custody, traceability, that sometimes the issues there, tracking matching the documents with the other minor infractions. There's a lot of blending, obviously, that's actually happening between all the different types of wool as well. The last issue here is basically how to get certified. So as part of this short presentation, I just want to kind of go over the general process. Textile Exchange basically has a very simple process of actually kind of going through each one of the different steps. And then there's the IDFL process. And then I'd also like to kind of share a couple of different things there too as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. What Textile Exchange actually encourages is basically step one is to make a commitment and set targets. Looking at what you can do and what you can't do. There's basically like certain steps that you can kind of move forward towards as an individual company to improve the efficiency of your company, or to improve the documentation. And all of these, each time that you actually get audited, we're hoping that I think that the hopes from Textile Exchange is basically that this makes you a better supplier, that you're more aware of the materials and where they're coming from and what happens within your location. Second of all is actually register your commitment, and you actually tell everybody that you're going to be doing this Textile Exchange you're going to be adopting the Textile Exchange standard, whichever standard it actually is. And then you share your commitment, and hopefully that you get, maybe there's specific clients that want going to be looking for wool in your particular region, or they're going to be looking for organic cotton in your particular location for production. and then the report of the progress updates. So this is basically just kind of a way to actually kind of, initiate the process. TE actually recommends that you actually kind of begin the process by actually selecting an approved certification body, which would be, in this case, IDFL. Then you send over an application to said CB, and then they recommend applying with more than one CB to compare estimates. And with IDFL, we always match or beat every other competitor's pricing. And so if you ever have any questions regarding pricing, please let us know. Third of all, there's actually an audit will actually be scheduled. That will actually be done as you begin the application process with IDFL. Then next of all, there's actually the on-site audit. And the on-site audit, the CB will send an auditor to conduct an audit against the requirement of the standard. So this is basically where the rubber hits the road. And then there's the follow-up if needed. And generally, there's always follow-up needed. This is actually known as the corrective action plan. Basically, any of the minor, major, or critical issues that actually need to be addressed, there's a time frame actually kind of provided for that. And then a decision is actually made on the certification by an in-house certifier. And within IDFL, it's a very similar process with actually the application, the review, and the agreement. So you'll actually see that usually that process, it takes about 1 to 2 weeks for any entity to upload and provide their, from the beginning of the application and figuring out pricing, processing the payment, and then uploading all of their documentation. That's usually about 1 to 2 weeks for that process. Then there's actually the pre-audit documentation process. And this is basically done at the speed of the actual entity themselves. So if they actually have all documents, then this could actually be done in 2 or 3 hours, or maybe 1 hour. It's just basically we have a customer portal where you actually upload all the documents. Then one of the customer service people will actually review your documentation. And then there's actually, and then if there's any additional documents required, then we can actually provide that for you. The evaluation, this is actually where the auditor goes on site, and IDFL will actually schedule a site. Maybe that actually takes maybe a few days. If there is an urgent situation, IDFL can actually help you speed this process up, and there is an expedited process, which a lot of clients have actually really appreciated, especially if they've actually allowed some of their documentation to lapse, or if there's other types of situations that are a little bit difficult, then IDFL can help out with that. Then there's obviously the corrective action plans, which basically, as previously mentioned, depending on if it's a minor, a major, or critical, you're given 30 to 60 days to correct that, at which time IDFL auditor will return to the site, validate, verify that the corrective action plans have actually taken place, and then IDFL issues actually the certification on the completion of that. Afterwards, there's obviously a lot of sometimes some CBs actually have very high audit costs, and then very low transaction certificate costs. And other CBs may be kind of a little bit different in that regards. Maybe they might actually have a very cheap audit process, but maybe like their certification or their transaction certificates are very expensive. And as we actually understand, as I mentioned previously, one of the major things that IDFL always likes to do is find practical solutions to our clients. And so this is basically a simple breakdown of basically what the cost actually is. So as you look at this, you can actually see that the textile exchange fee is going to be standard with regardless of whatever auditor you use within. If you're doing if you're doing an OCS or an RDS, those costs are going to be the same regardless of the entity. The things that you can actually save upon are basically the auditor, the travel, accommodation. IDFL tries to have auditors actually in various different locations that actually really decreases the cost of the travel. And then there's obviously just the overhead costs of customer service, IT, management, et cetera, et cetera. In conclusion, I would just like to say that IDFL is a fantastic choice because we compete on cost. We're the simplest and the most direct client. We uphold a lot of high standards of quality. We always work on actually making sure our clients receive the highest service as quickly as possible. We have some of the most experience in regards to the RDS. And we're one of the earliest adopters to the textile exchange standard. And we're a one-stop shop, not just for the audits, but also for testing, research and consulting, research and development, consulting, and many other different types of things. So I wanted to just, in behalf of the rest of IDFL, thank you all for attending this seminar today. We look forward to seeing you and meeting you in person. And if there's any further questions, please reach out to us. Join us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. We're going to be adding on a lot of additional things in the future. So